faiths, and times, and we like to think of them as evil, and many of them are. So then, why do we immortalize their deeds and their personas to the point where villains become heroes? Why are the lives of so many outlaws set to music, while many others are relegated to the hell of history? There aren't many ballads about Adolf Hitler, or Osama bin Laden, or Lucretia Borgia. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her father 40 whacks. Well, there's charming poetry that outlines a very dark chapter in our history. In this town there lived an outlaw by the name of Texas Red. Many men had tried to take him, and many men were dead. He was vicious and a killer, though a youth of 24, and the notches on his pistol numbered 1 and 19 more. 1 and 19 more. Outlaws have always accompanied our greatest accomplishments. Entrepreneurs or opportunists, they've gained equal footing with history's heroes and often become heroes themselves. Their biographies are researched, editorialized, fictionalized, and elevated to cultural folk status that is uniquely educational, memorialized in song. The morning passed so quickly, it was time for them to meet. It was 20 past 11 when they walked out in the street. Folks were watching from the windows, everybody held their breath. They knew this handsome ranger was about to meet his death, about to meet his death. So tonight we're going to examine some outlaws, okay? But we're also going to outline some famous outlaw songs to illustrate the connection to our folk history. Big iron, big iron. The stranger there among them had a big iron on his hip. Big iron on his hip. Several factors come into play in the creation of an outlaw and the mythological status they sometimes achieve. But for tonight, we're going to narrow our focus to America in the last 300 years because many of the names that we'll discuss will be more familiar. Now, this is not all to say that outlaws come from the Old West. The outlaw has been part of our culture and times from the very beginning. It's part of our collective consciousness. Even from the days before Abel and Cain, even Jesus was considered something of a rebel in his time. And the pirate lexicon, that's a whole other show in itself. But one of the first outlaws to achieve hero status in song was Robin Hood from 12th century England. Now, it's not really clear whether Robin Hood was a real person or a combination of persons or even a person at all. He might have just been an old English name for someone who was famous for robbing in a hood. And yet his legend has inspired fact and fiction and outlaws ever since. And songs, of course, like this one from the 1300s. Stop and listen, gentlemen, that be of freeborn blood. I'll tell you of a good yeoman whose name was Robin Hood. And this song literally has about 200 verses, but they traditionally end with Christ who died upon the cross, have mercy on Robin Hood. For he was a good outlaw and did poor men much good. So where did our American folk songs about outlaws begin? Not long after Lewis and Clark opened the West and the government started offering land grants to settle beyond the Mississippi, America became a land of opportunity. Millions immigrated in the mid-1830s to find a better life. Oh, there were Germans and Czechs and Poles and Dutch and Chinese and Jews. Many of them actually came from Ireland to escape famine and persecution, but they all brought their music with them. Now, Ireland herself has a 700-year history of domination by the British, so anyone who acted up against the crown became an instant hero. Irish musical literature is rife with songs about Irish outlaws. And this particular one follows the Robin Hood theme. But unlike Robin Hood, most Irish outlaws met a tragic end. It's of a brave young highwayman, this story I will tell. His name was Willie Brennan, and in Ireland he did dwell. 'Twas on the Gilworth Mountains he commenced his wild career, and many a wealthy nobleman before him shook with fear. And it's Brennan on the moor, Brennan on the moor, oh brave and undaunted was young Brennan on the moor. One day upon the highway as Willie went down, he met the mayor of Cashel on his way outside of town. The mayor, he knew his features and said, young man, said he, your name is Willie Brennan, you must come along with me. And it's Brennan on the moor, Brennan on the moor, oh brave and undaunted was young Brennan on the moor. Now Brennan being an outlaw upon the mountain high, with cavalry and infantry to take him they did try. He laughed at them with scorn until at last was said, by a false-hearted woman he was grossly betrayed. And it's Brennan on the moor, Brennan on the moor, oh brave and undaunted was Brennan on the moor. Outlaws were often betrayed by false-hearted women. Sorry, ladies. Now, many brigands may not be particularly evil until they're labeled so by their oppressors. Remember Thomas Francis Meagher, labeled an outlaw by the British for his failed rebellion against the crown in 1848. Yet within a few short years, Meagher became a hero in the American Civil War and finally in Montana as our first acting territorial governor. And as many of you know here, that is also another entire show in itself. Now, people flocked west by the thousands, stricken with gold fever in California, Nevada, the Dakotas, Montana. These were typically not your upstanding citizens. Many simply forsook homes and sweethearts and headed west to get rich quick. These were hard cases, gamblers, miners, quick with a gun and determined to make a killing in the gold fields, which is often what happened. And women of similar persuasions followed to get rich quick in another way. You see, not all outlaws robbed with a 6-gun. Invariably, if they escaped bullets or the gallows, they might find themselves locked up in makeshift jails on the frontier. Often their only hope of escape lay in their perceived sweethearts, who often realize that one lout is just as good as another. I am a roving gambler, I've gambled all around. Wherever I meet with a deck of cards, I lay my money down. Lay my money down, lay my money down. I had not been in Washington many more weeks than 3 when I got into a poker game with a man who cheated me, a man who cheated me, a man who cheated me. We put our money in the pot and dealt those cards around. When I saw him deal from the bottom of the deck, I shot that gambler down, shot that gambler down, I shot that gambler down. Now I'm in the jailhouse, a number for my name. The warden locked the door and said, you gambled your last game, gambled your last game, gambled your last game. Molly, oh dear Molly, why do you me so. Oh, why you don't come rescue me? I swear I'll never know. Swear I'll never know. Swear I'll never know. A common theme in songs of men turned outlaws revolve around revenge on a betrayed lover, with songs like They're Hanging Me Tonight, Sylvie, Tom Dooley, Stagger Lee, Frankie and Johnny, El Paso, Lily of the West, and this one, I killed poor Jed Bryan in a bad Laredo fight. Killed him with my bare hands for the girl I loved that night. But was she really worth it? I guess I'll never know. She'll be drinking someone else's rye when I'm 6 feet below. Till I became a wanted man, I never even owned a gun. But now they hunt me like a mountain cat, and I'm always, always, always on the run. A wanted man on the run. Well, some folks became outlaws on the spot, the spur of the moment, a knee-jerk reaction to some mitigating circumstance. Now, in what we call the Old West, gun-toting bad men and women and lawmen became an integral part of who we were, a product of where we came from, and an emblem of what we stood and stand for. The Code of the West, dictated by the disenfranchised and displaced of the post-Civil War era, fueled by the zeal of American immigrants, also many of them displaced and disenfranchised, became a code of conduct enhanced by dime novelists and some historians. Mining camps gave way to cow towns as the beef empire took hold in the West. The age of the cowboy was born, and the age of the cattle rustler. Of course, Western life wasn't as rosy as the storytellers and songwriters would have us believe. The average age of a cowboy was 17. The average education level was 2nd grade. And some just went bad. I mean, the sheer adrenaline rush afforded a young punk out to make a name for himself was hard to resist. None was more famous in the frontier Southwest than this next outlaw, feared by men and oddly revered by women. I'll sing you a true song of Billy the Kid. I'll sing of some desperate deeds that he did way out in New Mexico long, long ago, when a man's only chance was his old 44. There's Mexican maidens play guitars and sing songs about Billy, their boy bandit king. Ere his young manhood had reached its sad end, with a notch on his pistol for 21 men. I'll sing you how Billy the Kid met his fate. The bright moon was shining, the hour was late. Shot down by Pat Garrett, who once was his friend. The young outlaw's life is now come to an end. There's many a man with a face fine and fair, who start out in life with a chance to be square. Just like poor Billy, they wander astray. They lose their lives in the very same way. Billy and others like him quickly found out that the end of outlaw is law. Well, at least there wasn't a false-hearted woman involved. You see, not all outlaws came from the black and white. Either good or either bad. There was a lot of gray areas. And that's why we like these stories. They become lessons to learn from and teach from. And of course, music is one of our most powerful teaching tools. Now, for me, as a kid, I got caught up in the Western thing when my grandpa gave me his old hat. great westerns on TV. Though we didn't get TV until I was about 8 years old, the TV Western was a big influence in my life, and I watched them all. Whistle me up a memory, whistle me back where I want to be, whistle a tune that'll carry me to Tombstone territory. The Old West of my childhood was populated by rogues and ramblers, bad guys and lovable gamblers. Who was the tall, dark stranger there? Maverick is the name, riding a trail to who knows where. Luck is his companion, gambling is his game. Riverboat, ring your bell, fare the mile and a bell. Luck is a lady that he loves the best. Natchez to New Orleans, living on Jackson Queens. Maverick is the legend of the West. And not only were the shows great, but the songs were great too. Now, we had heroes bent on justice for justice sake in shows like Broken Arrow, The Restless Gun, Wild Wild West, Laredo, and of course, Johnny Yuma was a rebel. He roamed through the West. Oh, there were shows about the fancy dance, Yancey Derringer, Shotgun Slade, Bat Masterson, and don't forget, Paladin, Paladin, where do you roam? Legitimate lawmen populated frontier towns too, delivering justice from a quick-draw six-gun in shows like Lawman, Laramie, Gunsmoke, The Tall Man, Texas Ranger, The Deputy, Tales of Wells Fargo, Cimarron, or Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold. Long live his fame, and long live his glory, and long may his story be told. Well, truth be told, Wyatt Earp was something of an outlaw too. He walked a fine line. The frontier families were role models in shows like Little House on the Prairie, The Big Valley, Wagon Train, The Rifleman, Death Valley Days, High Chaparral, and of course, tall, dark, handsome rovers with just the clothes on their back and a few supplies in the saddlebag, never staying long enough to kindle a romance with a girl that they were destined to leave behind. It was very romantic. Cheyenne, Sugarfoot, Bronco Lane, Stony Brook, the Cisco Kid, the Virginian, and of course, keep moving, moving, moving. Oh, they're disapproving. Keep them doggies moving right through rain, wind, and weather, hell bent for leather, wishing my gal was by my side. My heart's calculating, my true love will be waiting at the end of my ride. But today's kids never heard of a singing cowboy like Hopalong Cassidy or Roy and Dale, Gene Autry. I'm back in the saddle again. Out where a friend is a friend. So now, of course, you're asking yourself, how can a kid watch so many TV westerns? Well, most of them lasted only 3 seasons or less, and some were on Saturdays and Sunday afternoons. And I didn't even mention the ones that I only saw once or twice. Lassie, Fury, Zorro, Sky King, Annie Oakley, Rin Tin Tin, Alias Smith and Jones, and if you're counting, I've named 42 shows so far. And in all 42, good wins out over evil. every time. Happy trails to you till we meet again. And not one of those shows had an episode that didn't feature a gunfight, a fistfight, a barroom brawl, a crime of passion, a robbing, a cheating, a lying, a double crossing of some kind. But you see, most of our TV westerns when I was a kid, when we were kids, were in black and white. And somehow that suspended the disbelief. We could watch those shows and turn off the TV and go outside into the real world, though it was all in color. And we knew that the only thing that was important was that good triumphs over evil. Right? Today, kids see shows that are with themes that are ripped from the headlines every day. They can watch those shows and turn off the TV and go outside, and it's still there in living color. I mean, it never ends. So what do you expect? I mean, today's shows aren't much for romance or valor or honor. My mother's infatuation with Gary Cooper actually became the catalyst that led me to where I am right now today in my career, when she had me watch High Noon for the first of about 100 times so far, when I was about 7 years old. You see, you can't have a villain without a hero to set things right, and the greater the odds, the better. Now, some of our most famous American outlaws came about after the Civil War, as they headed west with a chip on their shoulder. The high ideals of Confederates were justified as men wanted revenge. Rebelling against the new Union seemed an honorable and justifiable way to continue the fight rather than swear allegiance to a cause you didn't believe in. The outlaw becomes then an anachronism, a remnant of a romantic time gone by, in which a man's word of honor meant something, when an oath taken could not be rescinded. Though he may steal and kill, the code of the outlaw hero does not allow him to break his sacred word of honor. And thereby, the outlaw becomes honorable as well. Jesse James was a lad that killed many men. He robbed the Danville train. He stole from the rich and he gave to the poor. He had a hand and a heart and a brain. Well, Jesse was a man who was a friend to the poor. He couldn't see a brother suffer pain. And with his brother Frank, he robbed the Springfield Bank, and he stopped the Glendale train. And the status of some desperados was elevated by how they died. Betrayal somehow softens their image, especially if the betrayer himself is a coward. For Jesse had a wife, she mourned for his life, and 3 children, they were brave. But that dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave. At the end of his life, Jesse James is going by the name of Mr. Howard. After Reconstruction, the heyday of the Old West, which actually lasted only about 20 years, conflicted with efforts to civilize the frontier. There's little room or tolerance for the outlaw. The noble sentiments that drove many of them in the beginning was replaced by feelings of resentment, vengeance, and anger. This next is based on a true story, I'm sure. There was a young cowboy that walked into a bar one Saturday night, and he sat down at the bar, and he looked down at the end of the bar, and there was an old fellow sitting there that he recognized, who, in his day, was the fastest gun in the West. So the young cowboy walked up to him, bought him a drink, and said, "Hey, old timer, you used to be a gunfighter. I'm going to be a gunfighter too. You have any tips for me?" And the old fellow looked at him and he said, "Well, you're wearing your gun too high. If you drop it down a notch or two, you'll be able to draw faster." So the young fellow says, "Will that make me a better gunfighter?" The old fellow says, "You bet." So he drops his holster a couple of notches, whips out his gun as fast as lightning, shoots the bow tie off the piano player. "Wow," he says, "that's terrific. You got any more tips?" And the old fellow says, "Well, you need to cut a notch in your holster there, right where the hammer sits. You'll be able to pull it back a lot faster." "And will that make me a better gunfighter?" said the young kid. He says, "Yeah, you can try it." So he whips out his knife, cuts out a notch in his holster, pulls out his gun fast as lightning, shoots the cufflinks off the piano player. "Wow, this is great," says the young cowboy. He says, "Got any more tips?" And the old fellow says, "Well, you see that barrel of molasses over there in the corner? So what you want to do is dip your gun in it. I mean everything. The barrel, the cylinder, the hammer, the handle, everything." And the fellow says, "Well, will that make me a better gunfighter?" The old fellow says, "No, but it'll make it taste better when Wyatt Earp finishes playing the piano and shoves it down your throat." Outlaws represent a loss of innocence, a rebellion against authority, resistance to oppression and independence. It's the haves versus the have-nots, kind of like what's always been going on. Outlaws just do something about it, and they get away with it for a while. In fact, as historical scholar David Bodenheimer says, outlaws are far less sympathetic characters, classic narcissists who've laid waste and ruined lives in pursuit of no higher goals than self-benefit. Yet they remain romantic thanks in part to Hollywood. Look at Bonnie and Clyde or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. How can such funny, beautiful, lovable characters be evil? Yet they remain romantic. It's always wise, he says, to take history, like much of life, with a grain of salt until you find out who did the reporting. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. So, outlaws were only men, right? Of course not. We've had female outlaws and villains and rogues from the earliest time. Delilah comes to mind. And let's not forget Ireland's most famous 17th century pirate, Grace O'Malley. The Old West had plenty of felonious femme fatales. Pearl Hart, who, with her partner Joe Boot, don't you love that name? Pulled off the last stagecoach robbery in America in 1899. Laura Bullion, or Thorny Rose, joined the Wild Bunch, and she was finally apprehended with $8,500 from the Great Northern Train robbery. Rose Dunn became the darling of the Bitter Creek Newsom gang and saved her lover in a shootout with U.S. Marshals. Eleanor Dumont was known as Madame Mustache. In her later years, she shot a man in Nevada City. So did Squirrel Tooth Alice. Mary Catherine Haroni, or Kate, was a prostitute who befriended Doc Holliday and once broke him out of jail by setting a fire and holding a guard at gunpoint. She was called Big Nose Kate to distinguish her from another famous outlaw prostitute, Kate. So you see, there's lots of women outlaws, but the men wrote the dime novels back in those days, and they wrote about men. One woman, though, became the stuff of legend and song. Myra Maybelle Shirley, such a pretty name for a desperado, dreamed of an outlaw's life when Jesse James' gang came and hid out in her folks' farm when she was just a kid. Maybelle married the son of her first husband's criminal partner. She was known for her dead aim, her velvet riding habit, and the ostrich plume stuck in her Stetson. but you probably know her by her outlaw name. Belle Starr was a rider, while broke she break, but she promised to quit it just for my sake. She ties up one foot on the side and puts on, with a swing and a jump, she is mounted and gone. Hoopy-tie-yi-o, yi-yi-yi-o, hoopy-tie and the filly-yi-o. The first time I saw Belle was early one spring, riding the bronco, a high-headed thing. She gave me a wink as she waved me goodbye, and I knew I'd not catch her in the sweet by and by. The last time I seen Belle was late in the fall, dancing all night down in Thompson's Hall. She laughed and she danced as she gaily did go, and she promised to quit riding bucking broncos. Whoopie-tie-yi-o, yi-yi-yi-o, whoopie-tie and the filly-yi-o. And poor Myra met the similar fate of many of her outlaw contemporaries. She was shot in the back. Now, Will Rogers said, there are two theories to arguing with a woman. Neither of them works. Sorry again, ladies. Now, not all the outlaws on the range were men, or women, or even human. I was hanging around town, just spending my time, out of a job, not earning the dime. Feller steps up and he said, I suppose you're a bronc fighter from the looks of your clothes. Your figures me right, I'm a good one I claim. Do you happen to have any bad ones to tame? Said he's got one bad one to buck, for throwing good riders he's had lots of love. Out in the horse corral, standing alone, he's an old caballo with strawberry rum. His legs are all spouting, he's got pigeon toes, little pin eyes and a big rolling nose, little pin ears that touch at the tip. A big 44 brand was on his left hip. You neck and oh, a long lower jaw. I could tell with one eye he's a regular outlaw. Now this long story song has a funny ending to what could have been a tragic situation. I'll bet all my money the man ain't alive that'll stay with old Strawberry when he makes his high dive. And of course, as you know, in Montana, the weather can be just as dastardly as any madman or madam. Winter's so tough that the pioneers used to round up the farmers and hibernate them in the barns and thaw them out in the spring for harvest. Jim Bridger said he couldn't cross the Great Divide until he finally found a canyon that was full of frozen air. Clear and still, February's forecast, as the Arctic wind keeps blowing. Scant hope for an early spring, still clear up to your eyes, and still snow. Don't applaud, I screwed that up. In the 20th century, as I suppose has always been the case, the government became the villain. Now, government policies had created land rushes that drove Indians off their land, created havoc with the Virgin Territory, and decimated natural resources like timber, water, and the buffalo. In the 1930s, it all came to a head. The Great Depression created a new surge of outlaw, out to make ends meet in any way possible. Now, I'm not talking about the criminal element, the mob, the mafia, Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, John Dillinger. Those guys were just nuts. But the good outlaw outlaws had songs written about them. Like this from the Depression era's most prolific outlaw songwriter, Woody Guthrie. Come gather round me, children, a story I will tell. The pretty boy Floyd the outlaw, Oklahoma knew him well. This rambling story song tells how innocent circumstances drove Charles Floyd to a life of crime. And yet he never forgot his roots and became something of a contemporary Robin Hood. There's many a starving farmer, the same old story told, how the outlaw paid their mortgage and saved their little home. Others tell about the stranger that came to beg a meal, and underneath his napkin left $1,000 bill. Now the lyrics also contain famous lines comparing bankers to outlaws. As through this world you travel, you'll meet lots of funny men. Some rob you with a 6-gun, some with a fountain pen. As through the life you travel, and through this life you roam, you will never see an outlaw drive a family from their home. I guess if you have enough people feel sorry about you, you can write a song too. So with all the male and female outlaws going and coming together, it was inevitable, of course, that some of them would become in-laws. Bob Barker comes to mind, as do the likes of the Daltons, the Clantons, the Youngers, and so on. Now, during the Depression, no other couple was more famous, albeit briefly, than a pair of bank robbers on a 21-month crime spree across the nation's heartland. Part of their notoriety and status as good outlaws came about through a poem that was submitted by one of the pair, published in newspapers across the country. It's a romantic ballad that portrays the criminals as misunderstood victims of their times, a common theme. It's at once enlightening, tragic, and indicative of many outlaw stories. You have read the story of Jesse James, of how they lived and died. If you still are in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrel Gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and how those that squeal are usually found dying or dead. There are lots of untruths to their write-ups. They're not so merciless as that, but they have their little flaws. They hate all the laws. The spotters, stupid pigeons, and rats. They say they are killers, heartless and mean, but I say this with pride, that I once knew old Clyde and rode by his side. He was honest and upright and clean. 2 crimes have been done in America, not accredited to the Barrow mob, for they had no hand in Lindbergh's kidnapping demand, or the Kansas City depot job. Someday they'll both go down together. They'll bury them side by side. To a few it means grief, to many it's relief, but it's death to Bonnie and Clyde. Floyd, John Dillinger, and Bonnie and Clyde collectively killed more than 30 people in their brief careers, and all 3 were killed in 1934 within weeks of each other. Pretty Boy Floyd's funeral was attended by 30 to 40,000 people. The biggest funeral ever held in Oklahoma. Now, we've visited a lot of colorful characters in our western roundup here, but what about Montana in particular? Do we ever have any outlaws out here? Oh, Blackjack Canton, the Wild Bunch, that list goes on and on. So, one of the most controversial figures in Montana history, some say villain, some say hero. The problem is the story is so convoluted, it's been told so many times, in so many ways, by so many different people, it may never be fully resolved. Yet his actions and its consequences convinced Americans that all Indians are outlaws. I've chosen to illustrate this particular character with one of my own original songs. I read the news in the papers today of the fate of our fellows so far away. And Montana's little bighorn, more than 200 men will never return to their sweethearts again. Was it fate that led them on that awful day, their destiny doomed in a windless spray? To others not there was fate less than kind, like the mothers, wives, and daughters left behind. Oh, Libby, Custer is the name you wear, a blessing or a curse. Stay home, which is worse, when the dust and smoke has cleared away. What victory was made that day? You stay behind, sharing history's shame. When Custer is your name. You see, if you really want to rally folks against a certain other group, you first have to demonize that group. It's a simple tactic, and it still works today. It's easy if you don't understand somebody because you fear them. In dime novel days, there was no mass media. People were scattered in the West, and many of them were illiterate. You know what is funny? The Indians considered Custer something of an outlaw. It was Libby who spent the rest of her life trying to convince us of the opposite. Oh, Libby, were his hands like silver leather when they touched your features fair? Oh, Libby, do you think they came together on the prairie in a prayer? His legacy was saved that day when you created what we say, interpreting the orders that he gave. Now history is your slave. Custer's a prime example of an Old West figure that history still hasn't determined if he was good or bad. Again, who did the reporting? It's important to remember that the stories of bandits prior to the age of instant information were handed down orally. And we all remember the children's game of telegraph, right? Sure, much of their stories were based in fact, but by the time a story gets told a generation or two or three down the line, why, a strong, healthy logger with a good work ethic can become a Paul Bunyan. It's also important to remember that with so many pioneers having nothing to their names, if they could elevate their own storytelling abilities and implicate themselves into the company of an outlaw, they themselves became more important and the legend grows. Think about. You know the difference between in-laws and outlaws? Outlaws are wanted. and then California. In fact, in Bannock in 1862, it was still Idaho territory, not becoming Montana territory until 1864, the year of his death. He suffered from tuberculosis, but that's not what took him out. Handsome and charming, Henry Plummer was also cold, calculating, crafty, and conscienceless. Shortly after he became sheriff of Bannock, the murder rate went through the ceiling, as did robberies of stagecoach payrolls and gold shipments. His fate was sealed by a group known as the Vigilantes, no less controversial in themselves. You see, for every outlaw, there's always a legion of law enforcement officials right behind, some legitimate, some, like the Vigilantes, self-appointed. And there's often a bit of controversy, which makes a story. It said that Plummer was arrested as part of a north-south dispute, which is unusual because he was not involved in the war, which was still going on when he was killed. Some things are certain. He and 21 of his gang were rounded up and convicted without a trial and hung without a good drop. You see, that means if you're hanging somebody, you put the noose against the side of their head, and they drop through the, sometimes if there's a platform, it snaps their neck and they're instantly dead. If you put the noose toward the back of their head, they virtually strangle to death. And that's the perfect scenario for a vengeance killing. But after he was gone, the murder rate and the robberies significantly decreased. Now this next is a poem called Henry Plummer's Grave. It was written by Tiger Thompson in 1969. The first gold was washed in Montana in the year of 1862. A wild, hungry swarm came down on Bannock, while the devil stood waiting for his due. It won't take long from the big hole, if you don't mind the hot, dusty ride, till you come to the ghost town of Bannock. The outlaw sheriff, soon Grasshopper Creek was running red. When a miner struck it lucky at the diggings, he was panning out a price on his head. The people stood around and talked in whispers, on every face a troubled frown. Human life is getting cheap in Bannock when Plummer rode his stallion into town. He sat so tall and handsome in the saddle. His words brought new courage to the men. When he bowed from the stirrups to the ladies, they dropped their eyes and blushed and smiled on him. So the people chose this man to be their sheriff and heard his solemn oath to keep their trust, but little did they know how Henry Plummer would drag the name of Bannock in the dust. There was gun smoke on the trail from Salt Lake City, and many a long-line skinner, stout and bold, lay dead beside his looted treasure wagon to satisfy that sheriff's lust for gold. Vigilantes met in secret council. Judgment was passed by candle flame as witness after witness named the sheriff, the man behind the bloodshed and the shame. He met his final plea before his judges and was told that this day would be his last. Well, gentlemen, if that is your decision, build your scaffold high and drop me fast. The night when Henry Plummer died upon the gallows, the town looked up and down and put aside its fears. But many a snow-white pillow there in Bannock was dampened by a maiden's flowing tears. And now they say the ghost of Henry Plummer comes riding home each evening at sundown to share the night with rattlesnakes and spiders, the only living things in Bannock town. Up the Beaverhead, the Indian summer's dying, where the tall green willows used to wave, and the dry yellow grass is a sighing in the wind over Henry Plummer's grave. But the looting never faltered in Montana. And here's the thing that you should know for sure, that beside the ruling mob called Anaconda Copper, poor Henry was a bumbling amateur. It seems the author may have thought Marcus Daly was lastly, I have to mention that late 20th century country music gave rise to the outlaw genre through Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and so on. They weren't really outlaws per se. They just were artists who didn't like following the rules of Hollywood and New York and the big music publishers, and they tried to recreate a more romantic era. Buffalo Bill made a killing doing exactly the same thing. Even Bob Ford traveled the vaudeville circuit, reenacting how he shot Jesse James in the back. But Ford was reviled for the killing and met the same fate 2 years later. But what have we today in the order of outlaws as heroes? A culture changes the way we perceive society's deviance. Mass killers are not outlaws, but deranged and disenfranchised individuals. And we know now that simple changes in environment or diet or genetics can impact the way an individual reacts to the world and deals with it. And the war on terror has made outlaws of entire cultures. Sounds familiar. But we do have our share of outlaws. Some get huge publicity and others attain that status quiet, undercover. Some even get elected to Congress. I'm not going there. Our minds can create villains out of the simplest things, like a failed love affair, or a controversial political decision, or a bungled court case, or any manner of feelings of social injustice or imbalance. It's just up to us how we handle it. It was over in a moment, and the folks gathered around. There before them lay the body of the outlaw on the ground. Oh, he might have went on living, but he made one fatal slip when he tried to match the ranger with the big iron on his hip. Big iron on his hip. My name is Neal Lewing, and I'm from Polson, and I sure appreciate you coming out to learn a little bit about this kind of stuff. This is my fourth time here in Townsend to do some of my shows. I have 20 different one-man shows like this that I do. I haven't been here for about 3 years, though. Can we say, thank you, COVID? I would also like to thank the Canton Church Foundation here. You guys are terrific, and I love what you've done out here. I love these old venues that get turned into performance venues. And thanks especially to Vic and Pam Sample for calling me up and having me come back here. My wife and I run the Port Polson Players Theater over in Polson. We're about 10 days away from opening our 47th season. We have 3 great comedies on the lineup for you this summer. So the best way to find us is portpolsonplayers.com, or you can follow us on Facebook, because it gets updated a little more often than our website. I do have some CDs as well, which may or may not contain outlaw songs. Now, the stories we've heard tonight are not unique to America as a culture or a people. Outlaws come and go, history has its share. But also remember that there are heroes that work today too. And they far outnumber the outlaws. There may even be some of them in this room right now. They're just quieter about it. We have to continue to believe that the white hats will always overcome the black hats. And that is what we celebrate. So if you're thinking how romantic it might be to become an outlaw, just remember, big iron, big iron. Don't try to match the ranger with the big iron on his hip. Big iron on his